Everyone knows German tanks were feared. The Tiger, the Panther, the Panzer IV. These weren't just machines, they were psychological weapons. The sound of their engines alone was enough to make Allied infantry scatter. Their guns could punch through armor at ranges that felt almost unfair. Their crews were among the most trained, most disciplined, most experienced tank operators in the entire war. And yet, after 1943, something strange happened. Something that doesn't get talked about in most books. Something that the official histories tend to gloss over or bury under pages of statistics and production numbers. German tank crews, men who had driven into Stalingrad, men who had charged across the steppes of Russia, men who had fought in North Africa under brutal desert heat, started refusing to fight at night. Not officially, not in writing, not in ways that would get them court-martialed, but informally, consistently, and with a desperation that grew with every passing month of the war. They would delay, they would report mechanical problems, they would cite visibility conditions, they would find every reason in the military rulebook to avoid moving their tanks after sunset. And the ones who couldn't avoid it, the ones who were ordered into the dark anyway, they often came back shaken in ways that had nothing to do with courage. If you want to understand why, you have to go back further than 1943. You have to understand what the night actually meant in armored warfare, what changed in the middle years of the war, and why the darkness, which had once been something German tank commanders used to their advantage, became the thing they feared most. Stay with me through this, because what happened to German tank crews after 1943 is one of the most fascinating, most overlooked stories of the entire Second World War. And if you find this kind of deep history compelling, make sure you subscribe before we go any further, because this is exactly what we do here every single time. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with why night should have been no problem at all. 1939, when Germany rolled into Poland and the concept of blitzkrieg stunned the world, the Wehrmacht had a significant advantage in training in doctrine and in coordination. The idea of armored warfare moving fast, hitting hard, exploiting gaps before the enemy could react was not just about the tanks themselves, it was about how they were used. And one of the core principles of early German armored doctrine was operational flexibility. You moved when you needed to move. You fought when you needed to fight. If that meant night operations, you conducted night operations. And in the early war, German crews were good at this. The training was thorough. The radio communication between vehicles was far ahead of what most Allied forces had in 1939 and 1940. German tank commanders used what was called the open hatch philosophy, meaning commanders rode with their heads out of the turret, exposed to the elements but gaining a massive advantage in situational awareness. They could see, they could hear, they could coordinate. In daylight, this made them devastatingly effective. At night, it still gave them edges over enemies who were largely communicating by flag, by messenger, or not at all. In France in 1940, German armored units conducted night movements that caught French and British commanders completely off guard. The mobility itself, the ability to move a massive armored force through the dark and arrive somewhere the enemy didn't expect, was part of what made the campaign so shockingly swift. Night wasn't feared, night was a tool. In the early stages of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the same logic applied. German armored columns pushed through the night when needed, maintaining momentum, keeping Soviet defenders off balance. The Soviets, for their part, were caught in a state of organizational chaos in those early months. Their tank forces were massive in number but were hemorrhaging trained crews, trained officers, and workable doctrine. German night operations exploited this. They hit Soviet positions before dawn, they moved through gaps in the dark, they encircled armies in sweeping movements that began while the stars were still out. So the night was not an enemy, not yet. But something was building in the background, something quiet, something technical, and by the time it became fully visible, it had already changed the war. The problem was optics. German tanks in the early war period, including the Panzer III and Panzer IV that formed the backbone of the armored divisions, had optics that were genuinely excellent for their time. The Zeiss gun sights were precise. The vision blocks for the driver and the commander gave reasonable situational awareness in daylight conditions. When you were fighting under the sun, when you could see a target, identify it, range it, and engage it, German tank crews operated with a level of confidence and accuracy that was genuinely formidable. But at night, all of that fell apart. Without external illumination, the vision blocks showed nothing. The commander riding with his head out of the hatch could see shapes, shadows, vague outlines at best. And the deeper you went into darkness, the more that advantage in optics and crew training simply evaporated. A Tiger tank with its 88 gun and its legendary armor was one of the most lethal vehicles on the planet in daylight. At night, navigating without lights, unable to identify targets, unable to gauge terrain, it became something else entirely. Heavy, slow, vulnerable. The Germans knew this. Every tank force knew this. And in the early war, when German forces had air superiority, when they could project dominance across the battlefield in daylight hours, when the enemy was either retreating or disorganized, the night limitation was manageable. You controlled the day. The night was for rest, for resupply, for maintenance. You set your defensive positions as the sun went down, and you picked up the offensive again at dawn. This was the rhythm. This worked. Until the Soviet Union decided to change the rhythm. After the catastrophe of 1941, the Red Army went through one of the most dramatic organizational transformations in military history. It was painful. It was bloody. Entire fronts collapsed. Generals were shot. Officers who had been politically appointed rather than militarily capable were replaced, sometimes violently. But through all of that carnage, through all of that institutional trauma, something emerged on the other side that the Germans had not fully anticipated. A Soviet armored force that was learning, fast. By 1942, Soviet tank production was accelerating to a pace that simply defied comprehension. The T-34, which had shocked German tankers when they first encountered it in 1941, was being produced in numbers that the Germans could not match. But production alone wasn't the transformation. The transformation was in how the Soviets started using those tanks, and specifically how they started using the dark. Soviet commanders had observed with painful clarity what happened to their armored forces when they massed in daylight and charged German defensive lines. The results had been catastrophic. German anti-tank guns, German tank crews, German air support, all of it converged on exposed Soviet armor in daylight and tore it apart. So the Soviets began to shift. They began to use the night not just for movement, not just for resupply, but as a genuine tactical weapon. Soviet infantry would probe German lines at night, identifying weak points, mapping tank positions, noting the locations of anti-tank guns. Then in the early morning hours before dawn, Soviet armor would move forward under cover of darkness and hit German positions while the defenders were still transitioning from night rest to full combat readiness. It was not elegant in the early attempts. It was messy and costly, but it worked often enough that it became doctrine. And then the Soviets went further. They started training specifically for night combat. Soviet infantry units were drilled in how to move quietly in the dark, how to navigate by stars and terrain features, how to signal using sounds and prearranged gestures rather than visible lights. Soviet tank crews were taught to follow specific pre-designated routes in the dark, to use low-wattage shielded lights for navigation that were invisible from the air and from a distance, and to coordinate attacks timed to the precise moment when German defenders would be most disoriented. Combine this with the fact that Soviet production was fielding increasingly large numbers of tank destroyers and self-propelled guns alongside the T-34s, and the picture that emerged was one of a force deliberately redesigning itself around German weaknesses. And one of the biggest German weaknesses, as the Soviets had figured out, was the dark. But the Soviets weren't alone in this realization. On the other side of the world, in a different theater of the same war, the Western Allies were also working through the problem of how to fight German armor. In North Africa, British forces had struggled enormously against Rommel's armored doctrine. But the Desert Campaign had produced some hard lessons, and one of them was this: the Germans, for all their daytime dominance, were vulnerable at night in ways they had not fully solved. British armored units began experimenting with night attacks in the desert. They were imperfect. Tanks running without lights in desert terrain had a tendency to get separated, to run into each other, to lose orientation and end up facing the wrong direction entirely. The fog of war at night in an armored engagement was almost paralyzing, but the British noticed something important. When they did manage to close with German armor in the dark, the quality of German gunnery, the thing that made Panzer crews so lethal in daylight, dropped dramatically, and that gave them ideas. By the time the Italian campaign began and as the buildup toward Normandy accelerated, Allied planners were incorporating night operations into armored doctrine more aggressively than ever before. They were investing in equipment, in training, in the specific problem of how to make tank crews effective after dark. The Germans, meanwhile, were doing something different. They were doubling down on their existing strengths. And this is where the story gets genuinely tragic. In 1942 and into 1943, Germany introduced two tanks that would come to define the late-war armored conflict: the Tiger I and the Panther. Both were responses to the shock of encountering the T-34 and the KV-1 series on the Eastern Front. Both were over-engineered in ways that reflected a specifically German approach to the problem of tank warfare, and both were extraordinarily effective under the right conditions. The Tiger I was a fortress on tracks. Its 88 gun could destroy any Allied or Soviet tank at ranges that were almost absurd. Its armor was so thick that early Allied tank guns simply bounced off it. When a Tiger I appeared on a battlefield in daylight at range, it was arguably the most dangerous single vehicle in the theater. German crew training emphasized the exploitation of this advantage: shoot from distance, use the terrain, identify targets early. Engage before the enemy gets close enough to threaten you. The Tiger was built for precision long-range gunnery in open country under good visibility. The Panther was, in many ways, even more impressive as a battlefield tool. Its long 75 gun was devastatingly accurate. Its sloped armor deflected rounds at angles that made it surprisingly survivable. It was faster than the Tiger and more maneuverable. When it worked, and its mechanical reliability was notoriously poor in early production models, it was one of the finest tanks of the entire war. But here is what both the Tiger and the Panther demanded: visibility. The tactical doctrine built around these machines was fundamentally a daylight doctrine. You identified your target, you measured the range, you used your optics, which were some of the finest in the world, to place a round exactly where you needed it to go. You used your armor to absorb hits while you destroyed the enemy at ranges where his shells were losing effectiveness. This was not a doctrine that translated to the dark. At night, the 1,000-meter standoff engagement that a Tiger crew practiced and relied upon became impossible. You couldn't see a T-34 at 1,000 meters in the dark. You could barely see it at 100, and at 100 meters the range advantage disappeared entirely. At 100 meters, the 76 mm gun on a late-model T-34 was perfectly capable of penetrating a Tiger's side armor. At 100 meters, a Soviet anti-tank rifle team could target your vision blocks and blind you. At 100 meters, infantry with explosive charges could approach your tank and destroy it. The German advantage in equipment and optics, the thing that made German tank crews so lethal in daylight, was not just reduced at night. It was eliminated, and in its place was something that the Germans had never fully planned for: vulnerability. Let's talk about Kursk, because Kursk is where a lot of these threads come together into something you can actually point to as a turning point. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 is usually described as the largest tank battle in history, and in terms of the sheer number of armored vehicles involved, that description is accurate. But what often gets lost in the broad statistics of Kursk, the hundreds of tanks destroyed, the enormous frontages involved, the massive scale of the engagement, is the specific tactical texture of what happened: the individual encounters. The moments where German superiority in equipment was matched against Soviet improvements in doctrine, coordination, and preparation. The Soviets had built an anti-tank defense at Kursk that was unlike anything previously constructed. Not just tank traps and minefields, though there were those in abundance. Not just pre-sighted artillery positions, though those were lethal. But a layered system of interlocking defenses designed specifically to channel German armor into kill zones, to strip away the spacing and the range advantage that made German tanks so dangerous, and to force engagement on Soviet terms. Part of that system involved the night. Soviet engineers worked through the nights before and during the battle to reposition anti-tank guns, to dig new fighting positions, to move reserves forward. Soviet armor moved at night to avoid German air observation. Soviet commanders used the hours of darkness to adjust their defensive lines based on the day's fighting, to bring up ammunition, to repair damaged vehicles, and to plan the next day's responses. German tank crews, by contrast, were grinding through some of the most exhausting combat of the war during the daylight hours, and were then expected to maintain vehicle readiness through the night in preparation for the next day's assault. The operational tempo was brutal, and as the battle dragged on, as the initial German penetrations were absorbed and slowed by the depth of Soviet defenses, German crews found themselves increasingly fighting without the advantages their equipment had been designed to exploit. When the great tank engagements happened at close range, when the engagement distances collapsed from thousands of meters to hundreds, the Tiger's superiority margin shrank dramatically. When Soviet forces launched counterattacks in the early morning hours, catching German units still in their night defensive positions, the disorientation and the reduced visibility created exactly the kind of chaos that German tactical doctrine was least equipped to handle. Kursk didn't end German armored dominance overnight, but it demonstrated with brutal clarity several things that would define the rest of the war: that Soviet armored forces were now capable of matching German tactics and exceeding German numbers, that the defensive depth the Soviets could construct was sufficient to absorb even the best German armored assault, and that the specific conditions under which German tanks were most lethal, good visibility, long range, controlled tempo, were conditions that the enemy was actively working to deny. After Kursk, the strategic initiative in the east passed to the Soviet Union and never came back. And as Soviet forces shifted to the offensive, As they began launching their own massive armored operations, the problem of night combat moved from theoretical vulnerability to immediate, pressing reality for German tank crews. Because the Soviets attacked at night, systematically, deliberately, with increasing skill. And here is where we need to talk about something that most popular histories barely mention. Soviet night fighting doctrine as it developed from 1943 onward was not accidental. It was not improvised. It was the product of specific tactical analysis and specific training programs built around German weaknesses. Soviet commanders had studied what happened when their forces attacked in daylight against prepared German defensive positions. They had watched their armor get destroyed at ranges where the German crews operated in complete safety. And they had concluded that the answer was to close the range, to get inside German standoff capability, and to do it in conditions where German optics and German precision gunnery could not function. Night was the answer. Soviet infantry divisions were trained to infiltrate German lines in darkness, to identify tank parks and crew positions, to mark approach routes for following armored units, and to neutralize anti-tank positions before dawn assaults. Soviet tank crews were trained to navigate using a system of shielded guide lights and preset compass bearings. Soviet artillery was registered to fire on German tank assembly areas during the night hours, disrupting rest and preventing maintenance. The entire system was designed to exploit the window when German armored superiority was most degraded. And it worked. German after-action reports from the Eastern Front after Kursk are filled with accounts of night attacks that produced disproportionate casualties. Not because the Soviet equipment was better at night, because it wasn't. The T-34 had no genuine night fighting equipment either. But because the Soviets had built tactics around what they could do in the dark, while the Germans were still anchored to a doctrine that depended on conditions they could no longer reliably create. But the Eastern Front, dramatic as it was, is only part of the story. Because at the same time that Soviet doctrine was evolving in the East, something technologically transformative was happening in the West. Something that would make the night a genuinely different kind of battlefield. The Germans were working on infrared technology. This sounds from a modern perspective like it should have been the answer to everything. If you can see in the dark and your enemy cannot, the night becomes your domain again. The vulnerability disappears. And German engineers, particularly those working with the firm AEG, understood this exactly. The project was ambitious. The goal was to equip German tanks with active infrared searchlights paired with special viewing devices that would allow crews to see at night while the enemy remained blind. The system that eventually entered limited production was called Sperber, meaning Sparrowhawk, for the commander, and FG-1250, which was the infrared sight unit. The basic concept was an infrared spotlight mounted on the tank that would project light invisible to the naked eye. A receiving device, something like an early night vision scope, would then translate that infrared reflection into a visible image for the crew. In testing, the results were genuinely impressive. The system could allow target identification at ranges of several hundred meters in complete darkness. For a tank crew that had been effectively blind after sunset, this was revolutionary. But the problems were significant. First, the technology was bulky, heavy, and fragile. The infrared spotlight was a large and delicate piece of equipment that did not respond well to the vibration, the mud, the mechanical stress of actual combat operations. Units that received the equipment found that maintaining it in the field was enormously difficult. Replacement parts were scarce. Technical expertise to repair failures was rare. Vehicles fitted with the system often had it break down before they ever used it in action. Second, the range was limited. Even under ideal conditions, the infrared system gave useful visibility to a few hundred meters. This was better than nothing, dramatically better, but it was nowhere near the 1,000-meter-plus standoff range that formed the core of German anti-tank doctrine. Even with infrared, German tank crews were being pushed into the kind of close-quarters night engagement that their equipment and their training had not been built around. Third and most significantly, the system was vulnerable to compromise. Active infrared works by projecting light. That light is invisible to the naked eye, but it is not invisible to another infrared receiver. By 1944, both Soviet and Allied forces were experimenting with their own infrared detection equipment, and the prospect of an enemy who could see your searchlight while you could not see him was terrifying. A tank using its infrared spotlight was essentially announcing its position to any enemy equipped with even basic detection capability. The system entered service in very limited numbers. Some Panther tanks were fitted with the equipment, particularly toward the end of the war. There are accounts of night engagements in 1945 where Panthers equipped with the Sperber system performed effectively against Soviet armor that was still essentially fighting blind after dark. But these were isolated instances. The technology came too late, in too small numbers with too many practical limitations to fundamentally change the situation. And for the vast majority of German tank crews, who never received the equipment and would not have had the technical support to maintain it if they had, the Dark remained exactly what it had been since 1943. A place where their advantages disappeared and their vulnerabilities multiplied. Now let's talk about what this actually felt like, because this history deserves to be more than statistics and technology assessments. The crews inside those tanks were human beings, and what they experienced in those night engagements was something that goes beyond tactical analysis. German tank crew accounts from the Eastern Front after Kursk describe night combat in terms that are remarkably consistent across different sources, different units, different theaters. The words that come up again and again are disorientation, helplessness, and noise. Imagine being inside a tank at night. The hatches are closed because you are in a combat zone and the darkness outside offers no protection from someone who knows where you are even if you cannot see them. The inside of the tank is hot, loud, and cramped. The engine noise is constant. Communication with the outside world is through the radio, which is your only connection to what is happening around you. And through the vision blocks, which are small glass prisms set into the armor, you can see almost nothing. Shapes. Shadows, the flicker of something burning in the distance, that is all. Then there is a sound, something hits the hull. You don't know if it was an anti-tank round that failed to penetrate, a rock thrown up by the tracks, or a Soviet engineer who has just placed an explosive charge against your tank. You cannot tell. The noise inside the tank when a round strikes the armor, even a non-penetrating hit, is catastrophic. It is not a dull thud. It is an enormous metallic impact that reverberates through the entire vehicle, that rattles every piece of equipment, that leaves your ears ringing and your hands shaking. And if you don't know whether the next round is going to come through, you are waiting in a state of tension that is almost impossible to sustain. German tanker memoirs describe the experience of listening to infantry fighting around the tank at night, hearing voices, sometimes German, sometimes Russian, sometimes indistinguishable, the crack of rifles, the distinctive sound of Soviet submachine guns, the whomp of mortar rounds landing nearby, and being unable to do anything about any of it because you cannot see what is happening. You cannot traverse the turret toward a threat you cannot locate. You cannot fire into the dark without potentially killing your own infantry. You are, despite being inside one of the most heavily armed vehicles in the world, essentially helpless. One element that comes up repeatedly in crew accounts is the fear of infantry approach. In daylight, a German tank with its crew alert and cooperating with nearby infantry was extremely difficult to approach without being seen and engaged. But at night, Soviet infantry had demonstrated repeatedly that they could close to within meters of a tank without being detected. And at that range, with a magnetic mine, a Molotov cocktail, or even a shaped charge improvised from a grenade bundle, an experienced soldier could kill a tank. Not a guarantee, not even a probability, but a real possibility. And the knowledge that it was possible, that there might be someone in the dark 10 meters from your tank right now, was a specific kind of terror that daylight combat simply did not produce. There is an account from a veteran of the 3rd Panzer Division, recorded after the war, describing a night engagement somewhere on the southern sector of the Eastern Front in late 1943. His unit had been ordered to hold a position through the night against expected Soviet pressure. The attack came before dawn. Not a massive armored assault, but infantry infiltration followed by tank movement, the classic Soviet night attack pattern. In the confusion, several German tanks were destroyed not by anti-tank fire, but by Soviet engineers who had moved up under cover of the infantry attack and placed charges directly against the hulls. The tanks that survived, his tank among them, pulled back at first light. He described the night as the worst of his experience, not because of casualties, though there were casualties, but because of the complete inability to understand what was happening. Quote, "You heard fighting everywhere and saw nothing. You knew they were out there and you could do nothing. It was not war. It was waiting to be killed." That experience, or variations of it, was repeated across hundreds of engagements on the Eastern Front after 1943. And the cumulative effect on German tank crew morale was significant. Not in ways that produced mass breakdown or open mutiny, the Wehrmacht maintained discipline far longer than might have been expected given the deteriorating strategic situation. But in ways that produced the informal refusal, the mechanical problem that was cited when there wasn't one, the reported equipment failure that happened to coincide with a night operation order. These were not cowardice. These were the survival instincts of men who had learned, through experience, that their equipment and their training placed them at a disadvantage after dark in ways that were almost impossible to overcome. And German commanders, many of whom had driven tanks themselves, understood this. There are documented cases of senior armored commanders pushing back against night operation orders from higher command, arguing that the tactical conditions made such operations prohibitively costly. Not refusing outright, not in the Wehrmacht, where refusal had severe consequences but framing objections in tactical and technical terms. The equipment cannot perform effectively under these conditions. The risk of disorientation and friendly fire is too high. The maintenance requirements for night operations exceed current capacity. These were legitimate arguments, grounded in reality. And they were also a way of translating what the crews were feeling into language that command structures could process without triggering disciplinary action. The Western theater after Normandy in 1944 added another dimension to the problem, one that was different from the Eastern Front but equally significant in its effect on German tank crew behavior at night. The Allied air campaign had, by mid-1944, achieved a level of air superiority over Western Europe that fundamentally changed the strategic environment. German ground forces could move in daylight only at enormous risk from Allied fighter bombers. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the Typhoon, the P-51 Mustang, these aircraft were devastating against German armor in the open. A column of tanks moving on a road in daylight in France or Belgium in the summer of 1944 was essentially a target. And so German armored units moved at night. They had to. The air threat made daylight movement suicidal. But here is the cruel irony. Moving at night to avoid the Allied air threat created its own problems. And when those night moves put German armor into contact with Allied ground forces who were also active after dark, the vulnerabilities that Soviet operations had so brutally exposed came back into play. Allied tank crews in 1944 were not, in most cases, equipped with dramatically superior night vision technology compared to their German counterparts. The British had some early infrared experimental systems, and American forces were developing similar technology, but widespread deployment was not yet a reality. What the Allies had, however, was a different doctrinal approach to night contact. And they had something that would prove enormously significant: better artillery coordination. The Allied fire support system by 1944 was a mature, well-practiced capability. Forward observers could call fire on German positions with speed and accuracy. Illumination rounds, artillery shells designed to burst overhead and light the battlefield with a magnesium flare, could transform night engagements by removing the darkness that German crews depended on for concealment. And in a theater where Allied artillery density was high and ammunition supply was generally adequate, illumination fire could be sustained for extended periods. German tank crew moving through the dark, trying to navigate to a new position or conduct a night attack, suddenly hit by a cascade of artillery illumination, found itself in the worst possible situation. Lit up, exposed, visible to every Allied anti-tank gun and tank in the area while its own crew still struggled to identify targets through their limited optical systems. The illumination benefit was entirely one-sided. The Allies could see the German tanks. The German crews could not effectively identify and engage their attackers. This combination, Allied air superiority forcing German armor to move at night, combined with Allied artillery illumination capability that neutralized the concealment value of darkness, while German crews remained effectively blind, created a tactical trap that there was no easy answer to. Move in daylight and face the fighter bombers. Move at night and face disorientation, infantry threat, and the possibility of artillery illumination turning concealment into exposure. German tank commanders began referring to this period in their post-war memoirs in terms that reflect the psychological impact of this trap. There was no good option. The advantages that had made the Panzer Force so dominant in 1939 and 1940 had been systematically dismantled, not by any single enemy development, but by a convergence of tactical, technological, and operational factors that left German armor increasingly unable to control the conditions of its own engagement. Let's talk about the specific mechanics of why night fighting was so different in terms of vehicle performance, because the human element and the doctrinal element only tell part of the story. The machines themselves were a problem. German tanks of the late war period were complex, demanding machines. The Tiger I was notoriously difficult to maintain even under ideal conditions. Its running gear, the interleaved road wheel system that gave it superior cross-country performance, was a maintenance nightmare. Mud, ice, and debris packed into the spaces between the wheels with such enthusiasm that crews on the Eastern Front found their tanks frozen immobile overnight as temperatures dropped and the mud that had packed into the wheels solidified. This problem was severe enough that it was addressed in later production variants and in the King Tiger design, but for much of the war it was a genuine operational constraint. But beyond the specific mechanical problems of individual vehicles, night operations created a general maintenance challenge that was extremely difficult to manage. Tank engines need servicing, tracks need inspection and adjustment, fuel and ammunition need to be replenished. These tasks, which are routine in daylight with proper support infrastructure, become enormously more difficult in the dark. Working on a tank engine by flashlight, which must be carefully shielded to prevent observation, in mud, in winter cold, under the threat of artillery fire, is an exercise in controlled misery. And crews who were already exhausted from daytime combat were then expected to perform this maintenance through the hours when they might otherwise have been resting. The German army's solution to this, in theory, was a robust support and logistics system that would handle maintenance and resupply, freeing crews for rest. But by 1943, the Wehrmacht's logistics system on the Eastern Front was under enormous strain. Extended supply lines, partisan interdiction, Soviet air attacks on supply columns, the simple scale of operations, all of these factors degraded the support available to frontline armored units. Crews increasingly found themselves performing maintenance that should have been handled by support elements, cutting into the rest time that was essential for effective operations. A tank crew that has spent the day in combat and then spent half the night performing maintenance has not rested. They are functioning on inadequate sleep, elevated stress hormones, and the accumulated physical toll of operating in a cramped, hot, loud metal box. Their cognitive function is degraded, their reaction times are slower, their decision-making under pressure is impaired. And these are precisely the qualities that matter most in a night engagement where everything happens faster, with less information, and with less margin for error. German crews after 1943 were caught in a vicious cycle. Night operations were more dangerous because of reduced visibility and tactical disadvantage. Night operations also prevented adequate rest and maintenance, degrading the physical readiness of crews and vehicles. This degraded readiness made subsequent daylight operations more difficult as well. And the pressure of continuous operations day and night with inadequate support drove the informal resistance to night fighting that began to manifest across the armored force. There is a specific episode that illustrates this dynamic particularly well. During the German counterattack operations in Ukraine in early 1944, attempts to stabilize the front after the Soviet winter offensive. German armored units were ordered to conduct a series of night attacks designed to recapture key positions before Soviet forces could consolidate. The Tiger battalions involved were among the most capable in the Wehrmacht. Their crews were experienced, their commanders competent, their equipment, though worn, still functional. The attacks failed repeatedly and expensively, not because of Soviet armored superiority. The Tigers could still outfight T-34s in direct engagements, but because the night attacks produced exactly the disorientation and fragmentation that German doctrine had no good answer for. Units lost direction and ended up attacking positions they had not intended to attack. Some tanks became separated from the main body and were destroyed by concentrated Soviet anti-tank fire before they could rejoin. Friendly fire incidents occurred as confused German and Soviet forces ended up intermingled in the dark, and the coordination between armor and supporting infantry, which was the basis of effective German tactical combined arms, broke down entirely in conditions where neither group could reliably see or communicate with the other. After these operations, the commanders involved filed reports that were, between the lines, explicit statements that night armored attacks under existing conditions were not a viable tactical option. The wording was careful. Military bureaucracies have their own vocabulary, but the substance was clear. Stop ordering us to do this. It is costing us tanks and crews and it is not working. Higher command, under pressure from the strategic situation that demanded counterattacks and front stabilization, did not always listen. The orders came down anyway, and crews found their own informal ways to comply without complying, arriving at objectives late, reporting mechanical failures, conducting minimal movement and calling it an attack, then defending positions aggressively at dawn when visibility returned and their advantages reasserted themselves. This pattern of informal resistance and technical workaround became a characteristic feature of German armored operations in the latter years of the war, and it reflected something real about the state of the Panzer Arm as an institution. These were not uncommitted soldiers. The records show, repeatedly and clearly, that German tank crews were willing to fight at enormous personal risk in daylight conditions where they understood their chances. What they resisted was being asked to fight under conditions where experience had taught them, with brutal specificity, that their training and their equipment gave them no meaningful advantage, and where the probability of loss without corresponding tactical gain was high. This is a distinction worth making. The informal refusal to fight at night was not cowardice. It was tactical judgment expressed through the only channels available to men who could not write formal objections up the chain of command without consequences. They were not refusing to fight. They were refusing to die pointlessly in the dark, and given what the experience of night combat on the Eastern Front after 1943 actually looked like, it is difficult to argue that their assessment was wrong. The contrast with Allied and Soviet approaches during the same period is instructive. Soviet armored forces had built their night operations doctrine around the limitations of their own equipment as much as German weaknesses. Soviet T-34 crews operating at night faced many of the same visibility problems that German crews faced. The T-34 had no infrared capability, no night vision equipment, no technical advantage in darkness. What Soviet commanders had done was design operations that minimized the impact of those limitations by using infantry as the primary night fighting arm and keeping armor in a supporting role until conditions permitted effective use. In a typical Soviet night operation in 1944, infantry would advance first, using darkness and local knowledge to infiltrate German defensive positions. They would suppress anti-tank guns, mark routes, and establish forward positions. Then in the hour before dawn, when there was just enough light beginning to distinguish shapes but not enough for German long-range gunnery to be fully effective, Soviet armor would push forward along the prepared routes, close with German positions at ranges where the T-34's gun was effective and the Tiger's standoff advantage was eliminated, and over them before defenders could fully organize. This was the gap exploitation doctrine refined to a precision tool, and it worked. The Allies in the West were developing parallel approaches. British and American armored operations increasingly used infantry lead elements with armor and immediate support, with coordination handled by the radio networks that had become one of the genuine strengths of Allied combined arms operations. Artillery illumination provided by pre-registered gun lines could be called in rapidly to neutralize German attempts to use darkness for concealment. And the overwhelming Allied air superiority that confined German movement to the night hours also meant that when German armor did move at night, it moved under pressure, without its usual support structure, often without infantry protection, and in unfamiliar terrain. The situation that German tank crews found themselves in from late 1943 onward was the result of a genuine strategic and doctrinal reversal. The advantages that had made the Panzer Arms so formidable in the early war, superior training, superior radio communication, the open-hatch command philosophy, the excellent Zeiss optics, the precise long-range gunnery, all of these advantages existed in relationship to a specific set of conditions: good visibility, controlled tempo, coordination with infantry and air support, the ability to choose the range and the ground of engagement. When those conditions were denied, when the tempo was dictated by a growing enemy, when air support was contested and then lost, when infantry coordination broke down under the pressure of continuous operations, when the battlefield moved into the dark, the Panzer Arm was revealed to have an Achilles heel that its commanders had understood in theory but had not fully solved in practice. And by the time the scale of the problem was visible, the strategic position had deteriorated to the point where there were no good solutions, only a choice between different kinds of terrible. There is a final piece of this story that is often overlooked: the role of Allied intelligence in exploiting German night vulnerability. By 1943, British intelligence through Ultra, the program for decrypting German Enigma communications, had developed a sophisticated understanding of German operational patterns, not just strategic movements and order of battle but tactical habits. The pattern of German armored operations, the tendency to consolidate at night, the specific times when tank units conducted maintenance and resupply, the signals that indicated a unit had received a night operation order and was organizing for it, all of this fed into Allied operational planning in ways that were subtle but significant. Artillery fire plans on the Eastern Front, coordinated by Soviet intelligence services that had their own networks of agent reporting and aerial observation, were increasingly timed to German night consolidation periods, the hours when German tanks were most concentrated and least mobile. When crews were performing maintenance and consuming rations and trying to sleep, became the hours when Soviet artillery concentrated its interdiction fire, not coincidentally, by design. Allied bombing operations in the West similarly targeted German armored assembly areas and approach routes during the nighttime movement, windows that German commanders had been forced to use by Allied air superiority. The circular irony was complete. German armor moved at night to avoid Allied air attack, but the night movement patterns themselves were observed and predicted, and the bombing followed the tanks even into the dark. German armored commanders were aware that their movements were being tracked, that the patterns of their operations were being analyzed and anticipated. This awareness added another layer of psychological pressure to the night operations problem. It was not just that night fighting was tactically disadvantageous. It was that moving at night could actually alert the enemy to your intentions in ways that daylight movement, paradoxically, might not. A tank unit observed moving in daylight might be interpreted as any number of things. A tank unit moving at night in an area where night movement had become the established German pattern signaled specifically that an operation was imminent. This was one more reason why experienced German tank commanders pushed back against night operations wherever they could. Not just the tactical vulnerability of the crews and vehicles in the dark, but the operational intelligence risk of establishing predictable patterns that an increasingly capable enemy could exploit. The cumulative weight of all of these factors, the tactical disadvantage of fighting blind, the psychological toll on crews, the maintenance and logistics challenges, the intelligence exploitation of night movement patterns, the failure of German doctrine to adapt to conditions where standoff gunnery was not feasible, the insufficient